Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
You were the only child?
No, I'm not. I'm one of six.
How did they raise six children?
My mother's very forceful character. And, well, kind of unusual too, because my siblings come from a range of different countries too. So where my parents went, they'd adopt children. And
Adopted?
My mother, I have 3 adopted brothers.
So they didn't have 6 children?
They had 3 of their own and 3 adopted children. But they're all considered, as it were, all part of the family. But my mother has both a very charitable instinct, and they had decided very early on they wanted a large family. So my mother couldn't have more children, so they decided to adopt. And when we were living in Chile, for instance, my mother worked in an orphanage in a very poor part of town and used to bring home children every week to see what it was like living in a family. And after a year and a half or 2 years of having been there, we left Chile and they adopted a boy who we don't recollect him terribly well because there were so many coming through the house, but he became our new brother. We already had one other brother. We considered it terribly exotic having siblings from all different countries.
And you had large homes?
We had fairly large homes, and the nice thing about, I suppose, growing up in South America is that there's lots of help. But my mother still did quite a lot herself.
But they were wealthy, obviously.
No, they were. They just liked living a very exciting life. Having been born,
were working?
My mother never worked because she's considered raising a family a very important responsibility. But my father is a businessman. And you see, they decided to go to South America on the most romantic impulse because they had been entertaining a basketball team from Argentina during the Pan American Games. And they'd never travelled and just thought, wouldn't it, and these people are so wonderful and so exotic, it's extraordinary. Why don't we move to South America?
And you were born in Chile?
I was born in Canada, but grew up there.
You're the eldest one?
I'm the eldest natural child, yes.
And your parents are still alive?
Yes, saw them just yesterday. After many years of living in the West Indies and things, they moved back to Canada. So I remained here. They live in Ottawa, in the capital. Having left Canada when I was a boy, when we returned after a short while, I was made to feel so foreign that I realised what it's like being an immigrant. And it was just very strange. I never felt it was my home again, so I just never wanted to live there.
So what did you do?
Well, I carried on with my parents' course throughout, but when I finished my schooling in the West Indies, I decided to I thought I'd go to university first in Canada, but then I finished that degree, then went on to
University of
Manitoba, right in the centre.
Yeah, but what did you study?
I read architecture.
So you are an architect?
Of a sort. I think that the adventure was very important in my parents' life, and us too as well, because we liked this peripatetic life. And I think they got so enraptured by the whole exoticism and the liveliness of the life in South America, because when we were there in Chile, it was just before things got rather rough with Allende. And, for instance, my father was abducted by leftist guerrillas for a very short time, but sufficiently long to make it a great adventure. But this adventure and many other terrible things that happened to my parents when they were there made them so much in love with this very lively, exotic life that they decided they'd probably want to spend as many years as they could living in Central and South America and West Indies. So that's what it is, from this instinct, just from one place to the next.
Do you speak Spanish?
I do. It was very good, but it's a bit rusty now. But I went to school in Spanish. In fact, we all spoke Spanish at home, so much so that when we did eventually move back to Canada, between countries, that we had to take English for new Canadians because we didn't speak any English. It was so awful, our English, that we had to relearn our English. And we had to take these courses for new immigrants. And my parents also, being, again, very sort of alternative, dressed us up as native Chileans, much to the horror of these Canadian school children who made great fun of us. So we were slightly ostracised for being exotics. But we didn't mind because I think coming from a large family, you feel reasonably secure because there are so many of you that you just fall into each other. And it was also, my mother so incredibly powerful that you would never question her authority. I come from a strong matriarchal family of Irish people and the mothers just dictate what goes on, and whatever they say goes. So there's no questioning the authority. So when we were told we were moving away for the first time, my mother would just say, "You're going to have a wonderful time. That's it. There's no questions," which was good.
And why did you study architecture?
I was always keen on design and building, and ever since I was a child. And I had mapped out other alternatives. I thought I might be a farmer or a medical doctor, because most of my family are medical doctors. But I decided to go for architecture because it was something that appealed to me in terms of building. But when I started it, after having done it for a few years, I decided I didn't want to build monuments and wasn't so keen on the whole hierarchy of architecture. So I changed the course of my studies to read landscape, which again had been a great interest of mine. So I'd always been an avid gardens person.
Landscape doesn't necessarily mean garden.
Not
right?
at all, no.
Because it has to do with
absolutely
the city,
which
with
is wonderful.
the mountains, with
exactly, and that's what I found so much more inviting and more interesting. Because in fact, I read my landscape course at Harvard, and when I was there,
How did you get to Harvard?
I got a scholarship to go to Harvard.
So you were rather good.
I was okay.
You were a good student.
I was a good student, and I was encouraged to pursue further studies. And in fact, having gone through school, absolutely hating the school the whole way through, I found that once I got to university, I really...
No, because people who
myself.
went to Harvard, they say I went to Harvard like they say I went to the pub.
Yes.
But it's not so easy to get into Harvard unless you come from a family, blah, blah, blah. And
It was a good choice. Insofar as I've been educated in so many different countries, I just thought if I go to university, I have to... And I'd always gone to very good schools. I told my parents, since I was this tall, that I always wanted to go to university and I wanted to be well educated. So they always made a point of making sure we went to good international schools and had all the opportunities that would make us able to go to university. I thought when I was applying for scholarships, I thought I must go for the best because that's what I wanted to do, exactly. So I did that. But what I found most revelatory about Harvard was that first, it was a great place to go. You have all the advantages of a very advanced sort of school. You can dip in and out of so many different courses at the highest level. I took some real estate courses at the business school. I did history, I did some architecture, I did all sorts of things. You could just go to a number of lecturers anywhere you wanted. Always the best lecturers from everywhere showing up. So a very interesting extracurricular life. But I found I really enjoyed there was a professor of mine who was a sort of geographer. And geography is something which I hadn't really considered, but which was obviously part of my life and such an important thing. So I got very interested in historical geography when I was there. And that's where I read my PhD. I came to London and read my PhD in historical geography at University College.
So you came to London?
Exactly, to read because I thought I'd done enough in the States and I thought I should go somewhere else. Again, like my childhood education, having been brought up in lots of different countries, I thought I must end, as I thought I would end, my education in Britain. And also having had family here and having been coming here since I was a boy, I just thought it would be a nice place. And I thought also in terms of landscape, there's no better place to read landscape than Britain. So I wasn't sure how I'd do it first, but I did find a very sympathetic reader at University College who was brilliant. And
University College where?
In London. I found this fantastic man who took me under his wing and I pursued a subject which had interested me since I was a child. When I first came to Britain, I'd been taking a train to go visit my uncle living in Edinburgh from London. I was on my own, I was 13 or 14 years old when I made my way from South America all the way here. And when I was taking this train up to Edinburgh, I looked at all these tiny little gardens like you have behind here in your house. And I just thought it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And I was fascinated by these tiny gardens. And I realised when I started reading around it, that the history of London, actually that these were absent from the narrative of the city, that everyone talked about the buildings and the great places, but no one talked about vernacular landscape spaces.
So you arrive in England, and you go to university for your PhD.
Yes.
And you like it?
I loved it.
You decided to become an English person?
I was already. I've been here now almost 35 years. But I thought I'd like to come to London, and when I came here, it just seemed a good place to be. If you, as I said, you want to study landscape. There are a few places that there's a greater appreciation for landscape. And also in terms of geography, which I really enjoyed, there's a real sense of geography. What's so amazing about America is they don't teach geography. I mean, Harvard hasn't got a geography department. It got rid of it in 1937.
You don't need it. Yeah,
They don't need it.
They only like to be in America.
It's true.
Tell me something.
Yes.
You said you became a landscaper, and one is a landscaper. What does he do? He goes to work for the City of London.
No,
he opens a studio. He works for someone.
Yes. Well, what I did was
He stays in the university.
Exactly. I had aspirations first of becoming an academic because I love teaching and I still teach part time. I like the whole idea of teaching and learning. So my aim was to become an academic, but when I finished my PhD, the prospects seemed rather poor, and I just thought I didn't really want to do anything. So, as it happens, when I was reading my PhD, I'd finished in 1989, 1990. In 1987, there was one of the worst storms that we'd had here for centuries, and it wiped out just huge, tens of millions of trees. And in a strange way, it made my career, because I'm very much a product of that, because what happened was that they needed people who had expertise in architecture, landscape, history, geography, to write landscape management plans and conservation strategies.
Who needed the state?
The state and private landowners, because it was a time when, under Thatcher, there was quite a lot of money, and people had been buying back their country estates and doing them up in a way that they hadn't done anything for a very long time, but they were focusing primarily on the houses. But what happened with the gale in 1987, in October 87, was that it decimated much of the south of England, with the consequence that there was lots of funding available and lots of interest in conserving landscape for the first time in a very long time, because everything had just been decaying gradually in that very British way. No one did anything about it until there was a disaster. So I was finishing my PhD, I had all these qualifications that allowed me to drop perfectly into this new world. So I'm part of this generation of people like me who just found a very auspicious time to begin doing this. So what happened was that a woman rang me out of the blue. I didn't even know how she got my name. This rather cigar.
How old were you?
I was 29, because I'd been at university for almost 11 years.
And what did you do at age 29 in London?
I just did my work. I had sort of become I'd always been on scholarships, so I'd never thought of earning a living. I was always taken care of. I had scholarships all the way through, ever since I started university.
But were you very ambitious?
No, I wouldn't say ambitious. I was curious. I've always had a natural curiosity, and I love research, and I love exploring things. I think I just naturally fell into my university career, and I found one thing led to the next, and I got more and more interested in other things. And every time, in a way, you see, my career is the opposite of most people. Most people specialise. I generalised. I actually started very specific with architecture, and then by the time I was reading historical geography, my interests were very broad. So my pyramid, as it were, was inverted. So I realised I could do lots of different things. But this woman rang me up out of the blue, a cigar-smoking peeress called Lady O'Hagan. And she said, I've got this wonderful job for you. And she said, I've heard about you, and you can work for this man called Azil Nadir at Polypec, who's bought some country houses and needs lots of help. So she collected me in this large black car, dumped me in a field in this country house and said, start work. And it was a very strange thing, because this man had no sense of landscape whatsoever, but had all the money in the world. And he was particularly uninterested, but it was fascinating. The properties were really beautiful, extraordinary country houses, among the two best in this part of the world. And they asked me to propel these things. Well, it went well for a while. They must say he wasn't terribly interested, nor was anyone else. But I enjoyed it. And then it all went belly up, because he decided he didn't want to pay anyone. So I was sort of chucked out like so many people. And
he didn't pay you?
He paid me for a while, and then for a long time he stopped paying me. Okay. And I'd never really worked before for anyone, so I just thought, this is not very nice.
And there was no scholarship?
There was no scholarship to cushion me. But I was fortunate that I decided, I'm very resilient, so I just picked myself up and I thought, I'll just find anything to just do some work. So I worked for a contemporary art agency. Well, I met someone at a party. My entire career has been made just with strange coincidence of meeting people. I just was looking for a job, and this woman said, we can help you out. So I was editing publications for this art place. And then an advert came up after I'd been there for about a year for a landscape office looking for somebody. And I applied for that, and it was really very good. I was very disorganized when I went there, because I didn't really expect I was ever going to work as a landscape architect. I didn't really like the idea at first, but I thought, well, maybe I should use some of the things I've been trained to do for all these years. And I got this job and it was very interesting. It was quite a well-known practice at the time called Elizabeth Banks Associates, and it specialised in the conservation of historic parks and gardens. And I'd heard about it a bit when I was at Harvard because my flatmate had worked for this office. So I knew about it and I knew their work. And the funny thing was, of course, when I went to the interview, they liked my work, obviously, that went reasonably well. And they said, and what did you think about my flatmate? They said, what do you think about Nigel? I said, I thought he was an arsehole. And they said, oh, hooray, we love you. Because he was very unpopular. I've always been very straight about speaking, very frankly. But it was a great thing. So I worked for them for off and on, still doing some contemporary art stuff on the side for several years, and then decided I'd like to go out on my own.
What did you do with them?
I was doing conservation management plans and design of new landscapes and old landscapes, repairing things, but working on big estates, working for the National Trust, with English Heritage, and lots of private landowners. But after a while, I thought, well, actually, I've always been reasonably well connected, and I thought, well, I'm taking in a lot of work. Why don't I just do it myself, I could do somebody's landscape. So I decided to leave and start my own practice, and it was very good. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And one of the fellows that worked with me, Tom Stewart Smith, who's a very eminent landscape person, we've worked together now in the same office. We started a little, like a collaborative, but we have separate practices, but we share an office space.
We're talking about landscape.
Yes.
Because I know you don't like the definition of being a gardener.
Yeah. I don't mind being called
gardener. You
gardener.
must have a lot to do with trees, with gardening. With,
I have less of a problem being called a gardener, which I call myself, actually. I'd rather that people have low expectations of what I do, and then I hope I can change their mind. But there are so many very poor landscape architects, in my view, that do lots of boring work. I don't want to be part of that world. I've always retained two prongs to my career. I've always had an academic interest, and I've written books, and I write articles, and I write for journals all over the place, and art history, landscape, social history, things, and I love that. But I don't want to do that all the time, just as I like my design work very much, but I don't want to do that all the time. What I want to do, though, is to use my academic interests to enhance the work that I do when I work in the practical world. So that comes to bear where I'm working. I often do research because I like that. And not purely just to know the history, but I'm interested in the social context. I'm interested in the broader thing. I mean, it's the last incarnation when I was reading my PhD was transformative for me because having had a very strong design background, I all of a sudden was able to pursue the intellectual side of the work, which I really enjoyed. And so I could all of a sudden start reading about other forces that influence landscape. And that, for me, was spectacular because it just gave my work another layer, another degree of interest. So,
now, you said you worked for many landlords who had
Yes.
big estates, but you're also very famous because you worked on some of the royal palaces. You have rebuilt the Hampton Court Gardens, the Kensington Palace Gardens.
Yes.
And this is one side of your work.
Yes.
And then also you are very interested in squares, no? In the
Absolutely.
city of London and its square
Yes,
garden.
squares, exactly.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit about both?
I will.
I mean, how come you became the landscaper gardener of...
I suppose I'd been invited to do research first for the Royal Palaces when there'd been my life hinges on disasters. So there was a cataclysm at the Royal Palaces at Hampton Court in 1986, was a terrible fire. And they decided that they would actually try and refurbish both the palace and the landscape.
Are you a landscaper or fire?
Exactly, I know. I think I'm making my own career by burning things down. But they had decided they'd do this like kind of Gesamtkunstwerk to recreate the landscape and the palace from the late 17th, early 18th century on the south side of the Privy Garden. So I got asked to help research that. And then one thing led to the next. And then the then director was quite keen to he was going to leave and he wanted to have someone who was sympathetic to his ambition, which was to protect and build on the landscape history and to revitalize the landscape there. So I was interviewed and got this job, and it's been a wonderful thing because I've been sort of the landscape advisor to 5 royal palaces in Greater London. And so I sort of have responsibilities at Kensington, Hampton Court, Kew Palace, Tower of London, and the Banqueting House at Whitehall, which has no landscape. But it's been a pleasure to be involved in both the everyday management as well as the long-term strategic planning.
When you say management, you talk to workers, to gardeners.
Exactly. So my initial role was because the palace curators found it very difficult to talk to the gardeners. And there's a brilliant garden staff and a wonderful garden manager with whom I've worked for the last 25 years. So I was hired primarily as an interlocutor to try and create some common ground between the two, because they just couldn't speak to each other.
Your idea was to bring back the original garden, but then to modernize it.
We had an overall aim at the palace to represent the palace in a more sympathetic way. The palace had been it started all in Hampton Court. It had been a really very neglected place. And there had been an aim to try and bring more people in and explain the history and the landscape. And the landscape had also been improved willy-nilly without any view to the history over the last century. So we decided that everything we did in the landscape should be guided by an understanding of the history of the site, because it's so rich and because it's so layered and because the layers are present. And what I like about the English approach, the British approach to landscape in terms of conservation, is that it's not about recreating so much, although we did have to in the Privy Garden there's more of that than most places, but it's still keeping the layers. So whereas on the continent there's a much more of a desire to recreate, like in France, maybe everything of one period, here we have gardens that have 16th century earthwork, 17th century planting, 18th century paths, 19th century flower beds, and all that can coexist. One doesn't seek to create a single period in time, but to add to these layers. And
you could add modern layers.
You add, exactly. And it's been to try and...
add?
For instance, what we've done the Privy Garden over, we've also done we created a new kitchen garden within the precincts of the old kitchen garden. But this was the first time we'd had a productive garden at the palace since the 18th century. And that has both didactic purpose to show school children and visitors, how fruits and things were grown and vegetables were grown within the precincts of the palace. And it's also because it's adjacent to the old Tudor kitchens. So it's that, and then endless places. Actually, we replanted avenues, we've done all sorts of things. I mean, there are countless improvements. When we first started as a group, because I'm one of a team, we put together a conservation management plan, which was a vision for the next 300 years for the palace and its landscape. We did this before they even did this for the building. We established a plan. It's a general plan, but it has long-term aims to see the refurbishment of major landscape features.
These palaces are not used by the Queen, right?
No, these are uninhabitable palaces.
Kensington.
Kensington has changed, but these are basically uninhabitable
What do they
palaces.
Are? Museums like Versailles?
They're kind of like museums. And they were opened from the early 19th century, but they've changed a lot over the centuries. But, for instance, the landscape of Hampton Court, much of it, although there are lots of historic bits from earlier days, has been changed from the early 19th century.
Do these palaces belong to the Queen?
They do. They belong to the reigning monarch, and they are royal palaces, and they're maintained at no cost to the public. It's all the money, there's no public subvention. All the money is raised through admissions. So basically what happened was that after the fire in 1986, the Crown had to devise a mechanism to pay, because they realised that the Department of Works...
When you say the Crown, who's deciding that?
Well, there was this thing, it was until then managed by this thing called the Ministry of Works, basically, Department of Works. They really wanted to cut these because they thought this is, it's expensive to run these palaces, and there'd been this fire, and all this money had to be spent, and they were thinking, what can we do to make this worthwhile? Well, it was obviously that this would be a great attraction, but it needed funding and it needed a long-term view. So they invented this thing called Historic Royal Palaces, which is an independent charity which was established to maintain in perpetuity the palaces at no cost to the Crown. So we're stewards, as it were, for the royal family, so that we look after the palaces, and it doesn't cost them any money. And all the money that's generated by admissions is reinvested in the display and maintenance of the palaces. So my consulting is done not directly to the Crown, but to the historic royal palaces.
Who is running this historical palace?
Well, we have the number of trustees, and then there's a chairman, but it's basically a trusteeship.
The actual monarch doesn't have anything to say?
She's represented by the director of the Royal Collection, who sits on the board. And when it was initially set up, there was this fellow called Lord Airlie, who was very close to the Queen, and it was set up. But you see, these palaces had been uninhabited since 1737.
And what about Kensington? Because Kensington is also part of it's close to Hyde Park.
Yeah,
it's inside.
Exactly. It's within the park, exactly. So what happened was that Kensington is unusual insofar as that Kensington has for a very long time had royals living within it, but they're not direct members of the royal family. They are direct members of the royal family, but they're royal dukes and duchesses who have lived there and had apartments at the palace. So it was, from the 19th century, it's always been a favourite resort of members of the royal family. It was called the Great Aunt Heap because so many German relations of Queen Victoria came to live there. They were basically, people who had great titles but not a lot of money, and they were put there by the reigning monarch. So until very recently, it was just that kind of strange place where part of the palace had been open since the early 19th century, but only a little bit. And there was no real connection to the landscape at all. And that was largely because most of the important apartments and some of the ground had been lived in by Princess Margaret, who'd been given apartments there on her marriage by her sister, the Queen. On her death, this land reverted to the Crown, and it was decided that they could renegotiate this and open this up and open the palace to the public in a much better way. And the intention was, and this I was very much part of this, was to reconnect the palace to the park. Because what had happened was, since Prince Charles and Diana had lived there, Princess Diana, they put up all these terrible railings. I don't even remember. It was absolutely horrible. And it looked like a royal lunatic asylum for mad people. It just looked like that because there was big railings. You couldn't figure out how to get in there. Although it was partly open to the public, it was just a very difficult place. And yet it was supposed to be open, and it was just miserable attendances. No one would go there. So Historic Royal Palaces, HRP, we had been discussing how we might, in the event that this would come up, there'd be a day when Princess Margaret would move out, when she died. We had already thought about how we might start the work. But this allowed us all of a sudden to change the thing. So what we did is we changed the entrance from the north, which had been since the early 19th century, to the east, which allowed there to be made a brand new garden. And I won this competition. Even though I'm, as it were, the royal gardener, I had to throw my hat in the ring like everyone else because it was such a big job. They couldn't just give it to me. I had to apply like everyone else. So it was a competition, which I won. And I had been doing years of research on the place. My intuition was that they should look back to the early 18th century because the landscape in Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens is still very much a reflection of the period in which I was talking about. Basically, the layout of this is Baroque. When you start looking at the avenues and things, that's all laid out by Queen Caroline and Charles Bridgeman, the landscape architect in the early 18th century. So I wanted to put this, to reconnect this, because it would be very easy to do. So it meant doing things like removing 60 trees in front of the palace, opening up the views, very simple things.
Very cool thing.
I know,
the tree.
I know, it's not true. I'm always doing this. People are always saying I'm removing trees.
Are you interested in nature?
I love it. Absolutely.
Can you kill trees?
I feel because I'm working on design landscapes for the most part. And there are moments in the landscape history where there are opportunities to actually refurbish and do works to places. And very often it means tidying things up. And it also means making a comprehensive review of the fabric with a view to trying to come up with a coherent plan. At Kensington, what had happened is that for over 150 years, the planting had all taken place with a view to creating privacy for grace and favour inhabitants who had taken a large and coherent garden and chopped it up into bits. So all the planting was compartmentalising a garden which was intended to be much bigger and much more open, connecting to a large landscape.
But now you have Prince William living there, right?
I know, exactly.
And what does he say?
I don't think they are yet terribly interested in the landscape. I think they find it a nice place to live. It's a good place to live, and it's a nicer connection.
They don't try to close the garden.
No. You see, when we were over halfway through our project, this thing took 6 years. About the 4th year, we'd finally got permission from the Home Office to remove the railings, which were very obtrusive and incredibly awful. So we finally got permission, and only to be told very soon afterwards that the Duke of Cambridge was going to move into the palace. So they said they'd like to keep the railings. We said, absolutely not, because we made an arrangement, and there was money from the Heritage Lottery Fund, which meant there had to be public access to these parts of the gardens. So we said, we'll have to come up with another solution, but we can't put the railings back. So we made a new arrangement, which isn't perfect, but is much better than what they'd expected.
So they can have a private garden?
They have a private garden. And so it's absolutely fine. It was incredibly important that, and this is where we talked about trees coming down, that there are moments when you have to rectify things and create a degree of coherence. And we did the proper analysis. I mean, in fact, one has to consult very broadly. We had countless, there were probably up to 30 or 40 authorities we had to go to get permission to do anything we wanted to at Kensington. So it wasn't a matter of me just saying, I want to do this. We had to make presentations to the public, the council, which the plans were shown to the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prince of Wales. Everyone had to approve the scheme. So it took a long time. I make it sound easy, but it was a very complex procedure. And the reason why we were able to do what we did was because, in my view, because we had a firm historical basis upon which to suggest that these improvements were actually working towards an aim which was implicit in the design from a very long time ago. Because, as you know, in Britain, we're reasonably conservative, and especially in landscape. And it had been, in my view, you see, Kensington is the centre of the richest, most litigious, most difficult people in Britain. To do anything in Kensington requires a suit of armour and an arsenal of the most incredible scale. Everyone I talked to initially about the gardens and the landscape said, I know this place so well. I was pushed through the gardens by my nanny. I know every tree, every plant. And you think, oh God, what am I supposed to do? Because they just like it as it was, as they always remember it. Over the course of the years when I was presenting the scheme, the way I found most successful in doing this was to show them that I wasn't being a horrible pirate coming and just chopping things down, changing things willy-nilly, but my scheme had a strong historical basis. I could show them views from the 18th century that showed when this was open, how you're recovering the landscape.
And what about the squares?
Squares were another thing, yeah, but that's the same thing. Squares are a huge interest. And that again grew up from my interest in
only squares in London?
Primarily in London, because that's where they started. And it has the greatest diversity.
So what do you mean by squares?
Squares are semi-public gardens, semi-private gardens, I should say.
Not always gardens in the square.
No, but they were, this is the thing I'll explain to you, but squares as we know them now were considered from at least the late 18th century to be semi-private communal gardens that were enclosed with railings for the use of people who paid a rate towards its management and upkeep. So these were gardens that were used by people who lived around them. But the history of the square is, of course, yes, it was first they were intended to be great opening spaces in the middle of, openings in the middle of town, and they were for air and ventilation and light. But that was initially the aim in the early 17th century. But why they're so English is because they took these spaces, and instead of on the continent being arid, hard-paved spaces, like Place des Armes, stuff like that, they decided they'd turn these things into gardens. And it's kind of a combination of cloisters from old monastic institutions and universities, and combining it with this idea of open space. And it came up with a very English thing. And it is, in my view, the square is the most delightfully imaginative piece of English urban design ever. And it was a great gift to the world because it's copied all over the place, but never quite the same way as in England, because a successful square is a private square in a sense, and it
with the tenants and the owners pay.
Exactly.
And they have the right to
use it, but no one else does. It's an amenity, a visual amenity for people who walk and live around it, but it's for the exclusive use of the owners who look after it. It's their private land to look after. And why I love the square is because it combines my interest in design, history, and social use, because it's obviously the people, the history of the square is so extraordinary when you start reading about the social snobbery and all the sort of, the social engineering that goes around about it. It's more than anything else, it's a social organism, the square, more than a landscape.
And did you make a lot of squares?
I have refurbished. I've not really designed a new one, but I've worked on the conservation or the redesign of a variety of squares, and I've advised a lot of landowners. In fact, I'm doing quite a few now. So It was an unexpected benefit of my book, because I wrote my book purely for academic reasons, because, again,
a book
on squares, which was published by Yale. It was a culmination of 25 years of work. It'd been a long-standing interest, but I thought no one had written a good social history of the London Square. So that's what it is, really. It's written from the perspective, not as a designer, but as a cultural historian.
And in your work of landscaper, gardener, we never talk about the real thing. You know, what kind of plants do you like? What kind of trees do you use?
Yes, absolutely.
Are you using the original trees that belong to that garden, or bushes or flowers or whatever? Or you do it with your own taste?
It depends on where we're working. I mean, I think that I am a plantsman, but not a mad plantsman like some people who just feel that everything has to be right. I'm colourblind, so that means that obviously with some of my things I can't rely. I'm not like a real plantsman who knows every colour of dahlia or something like that. I have to go on general things because I can't rely on my colour. But I'm very keen on creating always a sense of atmosphere and evoking things. So what I really like doing in landscape is using plants as tools in terms of creating variety, surprise, all these other wonderful things. And of course, you know, I can create flower beds like everyone else and do, I think, a reasonably good job. But I really like using them in terms of creating effect. So that way I use plants, whether they're historically correct or not. I mean, oftentimes we don't now use always purely historical plants because there are modern cultivars which do things much better. But I love using them to create the effect that I'm trying to create within a garden. So, for instance, I always imagine that for me, gardens are theatre. And I think that what I enjoy is putting people within this frame so that, in my view, gardens are nothing, landscapes nothing without people, because I consider all landscapes cultural objects. So to have a landscape absent, you know, without anyone in it, isn't, to me, very interesting. I like, of course, wild natural landscapes, but those are just something different. But, you know, basically, Britain is a garden. I mean, the whole country has been recreated over the last 1,000 years.
Talking a lot about England, but you also work in Switzerland.
I still work,
in Greece.
I do.
What do? You export in English plant?
Not sure.
Idea?
No.
You work at the Morgan Library in New York?
Yes, exactly.
Is it like in London? Or?
Yes. No, for instance, in Greece, I'm a firm believer in the genius loci, this idea of creating a meaningful place, but using the environs to enhance your vision of what you're supposed to be doing. In Hydra, it was a very decayed garden from the 18th century. It was an orchard, an informal landscape, but on a series of terraces. My aim there was to create a more ecologically sensitive garden that used a lot of native plants. I wanted to use native Greek plants because it was very hard to find them, I must say, because the nurseries are so terrible. But I wanted it to look less like a formal Greek landscape and more like the landscape of the island, just within the walls. I wanted that to jump the walls because it was a very strong framework, and I thought you could actually do that. I found it disappointing that the nurseries weren't up to scratch, that, you know, you couldn't find all the things you were looking for. But I like having a response that actually responds to, obviously when I'm working abroad, I am reliant on the flora a lot because generally it's quite interesting. Having grown up in so many different places, I can work tropical places, semi-tropical, you know, whatever. So for instance, working in Trinidad and Barbados, where I've been working for almost 20 years, off and on, I grew up in tropical countries, so I know the flora incredibly well. And we had gardeners, and I work with gardeners, so I know how it works. And I've always had an interest. I always go to botanical gardens. I'm always making notes on plants. So I use that to inform the way I design. And again, what I try to do in most of these countries is use native plants that are neglected. For instance, in Barbados, I found, having grown up there, the gardens were too colourful for my taste. I found them all very gaudy. They're made for tourists, basically. I like the more indigenous landscapes, which again, very decayed, but I wanted to be informed by plants that were growing on the island that had been neglected. There are some wonderful kinds of grasses and some trees, and I just started using them in a different way. So I said, you've got some indigenous flora, which is quite interesting. Why not use that instead of just bringing everything in? And use fewer textures, but just more effectively to create this sort of sense of place. So, and the same in Trinidad too, again, using where possible.
What about New York?
New York, working for the Morgan is fascinating. But again, we have a very small site. In my view, that had to be a very European response. And I think that's what made my proposal very attractive to the Morgan, because J.P. Morgan was a very Eurocentric man. It was all about taking European culture to America. At the moment, there's no landscape around it at all. It's a miserable little patch of green. And it appears from the early drawings in the early 20th century that there had been an intention to create a garden. And the family had actually worked with one of the leading gardeners at the time in the States, called Beatrix Farrand, but no plan survives. So my aim was to try and bring things that could be associated with European culture, as it were, whether it's pollarding trees or special kinds of pavements that one would associate if you'd had any experience with European culture as European gardens. So I'm using materials also that are associated with that. So mostly Italian. And because that was one of the great strengths of the collection, or is. So I'm using those in that kind of way. So it's not an American response. I thought there it has to be absolutely the opposite. It wants to be something that's imported. So I think every project has to be, I suppose, approached on its own merit. I like going without a preconception of what I'm supposed to be doing. I like being informed by the client and by the local circumstances.
I read that you rather work for private people because you like to interconnect with the owner or with the person and talk.
I think it's a great part. I like landscapes that are responsive to people. I like the idiosyncrasy that comes with having contact with individuals. Of course, this works in other places sometimes, but I think that part of my job is to respond to people. And a lot of my work is very closely associated with living people who use landscape and who experience landscape on a daily or monthly or whatever regular basis. I don't see the point in doing work for people who have lots of money but no interest. It doesn't appeal to me. I like someone who's engaged, who's got a point of view. Lots of one's clients have over the years been art collectors, scientists, captains of industry, but all people who have had a genuine interest in the landscape. Who've said, they may not know much about it, but realise that it has the capacity to enhance their lives. And in that regard, I've always worked very closely with architects, interior designers, engineers. I don't generally like doing work where I'm called in at the last minute saying, oh, do something, we finished the house, can you do a garden? It just doesn't appeal to me. I love when someone says, well, we've just bought a place, we want to change it, we don't know quite how we're going to do things, we've got an architect. Would you consider being part of the team or starting a new house entirely? And then you have a real role to play in siting the building, changing the access, opening vistas, all the things that one loves to do that really make the setting so much more special and make a relationship between the building and the landscape.
You think gardens will last?
I think that an interest in landscape will certainly last.
In this technological world?
I think so. I think it becomes more and more interesting and more appealing because as we're sort of distanced from so many things, as long as there's still some sort of natural cycle to life, it sort of reminds us we're still human. Because so many things, we're now divorced from so many aspects of our lives, but there's an immediacy of landscape, which I think is so appealing, that makes you feel like you're living in the present. And also there's a kind of hope in landscape because it's all about future planning. It's not about
who were the examples you took or the people you considered
my mentors, my inspirations
in the history?
I suppose it depends on. I mean, for instance, I like people who are great impresarios that do both landscape and architecture and design. Things like, an example would be someone like William Kent, who I wouldn't say. It's not that I want to recreate his work, but he was someone who thought about everything. It was the whole picture. And I think that's very inspirational because it's this idea, I don't necessarily feel I have to do everything, but I like to be part of it. And it's nice to be considered as part of a bigger picture. So in that regard, if you have that bigger view, it really makes you feel like you're contributing to a more coherent approach. Basically, I spent much of my life trying to create a degree of coherence in otherwise that's why historical places are quite interesting because they've got layers and layers and layers of things, oftentimes that are not very clear. And I'm just adding another layer. And I think what I also enjoy about historic landscapes is that I'm not the last person there. There'll be people after me. I'm not creating monuments. I'm not interested in saying, this is my garden, this is my landscape. I don't care. I like the anonymity of planting a tree, for instance. So that centuries on or a century on from now.
There are Italian gardens, French gardens, German gardens, English gardens, American gardens.
Yes.
Japanese gardens.
Yeah. I like aspects of all these things.
You don't have your own garden. Your own idea.
I own my idea of garden. I'm too eclectic. One of the questions I think you sort of said in your initial emails about a philosophy of gardening, I don't really have a philosophy, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's more this idea that I like being kind of responsive to things. I'm interested in a broad range of matters, whether it's dealing with the local ecology to conservation, sustainability, all the things that people have to tick nowadays. I like those generally without being told. It's part of my job, part of my interest. But also, I like to respond to things on an individual basis. One of the great pleasures of what I do is that I'm called out very often, even for a short time, just to look at someone's landscape and give them some ideas. I really enjoy arriving fresh somewhere and someone says, "What do you think?" And I can rattle stuff off because I've...
Be a consultant, you mean,
yes,
instead of doing the garden.
Yeah, sort of like in a way, one person whose work I sort of very much like is the way he's approached landscape is Humphrey Repton, who spent his life sort of travelling around, just giving ideas to people, and just saying, you could open up this view, you could do this, you could move that. It's kind of interesting going constantly and just acting like a doctor does in a surgery, just saying what you might do, and without feeling that you're making specific recommendations, but just telling them, guiding them, giving them advice. I like that informal exchange of ideas.
And which are the cities, as you like, squares, and therefore cities that are more attractive to you for their gardens or parks? Or
I think London has to be the most extraordinary city in any regard in terms of the broadest range and the most diverse kind of gardens. About 25 years ago, I'm part of this group called the London Parks Gardens Trust, and we recognised that there's a great diversity of extraordinary landscape spaces across London, most of which were not understood or appreciated. So we carried out this inventory. We were funded to do this, and we put together a list and a survey, really. It's a very personal survey of all these spaces. And we've now got this database that has almost 3,000 spaces on it. And it's trying to tell people why these spaces have a particular significance in the metropolis. And it's not just the big parks, but it's oftentimes little tiny squares or cattle walks or open fields or remains of ancient landscapes or even modern landscapes that still have some significance. So what I've done in this journal is I publish articles by people on bizarre aspects of London gardens. So it could be on, for instance, the influence of garden squares in Honolulu, or even sort of creating places in landscape where you can teach children how to ride safely on their scooters, or just how landscape has been used in a variety of different ways across the metropolis, and just giving people a range of stimuli so they sort of get a broad understanding.
Ultimately, to be very much in love with London.
I like it because it's sort of...
Other cities like Rome, for instance, who have gardens or parks or a lot of greenery.
Absolutely.
And others who don't.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm basically someone who likes... The big parks are quite wonderful, obviously, and you get those in the great cities.
I mean, I don't want to be rude in any way. I'm not rude vis-a-vis you.
Yeah.
I think that London is not like Rome or Venice or Paris or a particularly beautiful city, right? Because there are, in those cities, there are palaces and churches and
absolutely
beautiful and obelisks and all sorts of things. Maybe gardens were a necessity of adornment in city that has these little houses.
I think there's more to that than just that. I think it's because many of the cities that you mentioned don't have, as it were, a landscape tradition. I mean, lots of the landscapes that are left are the remains of either monasteries or palaces and things like that. Where London's very different is that the impetus to create lots of landscape space in London, and the most significant part of landscape in London, is small vernacular gardens. Gardens like yours behind here. There are tens of thousands of acres of tiny little gardens, which have ad hoc quality of these strange little spaces where people make personal interventions. So, and where London, I think, is particularly rich, and I'm a citizen of the world, so I take the broadest possible view, but I do think I chose London. It's not my city. I made it my home. But I like it because it has the broadest range of the most diverse and eccentric kinds of landscape spaces. Some of them are not what everyone considers to be great parks, great works of art, but they are legitimate expressions of landscape. And whether it's a small bit that's left over or something, but there's an interest, and there has been in London for at least 400 years, for almost all classes of people to create landscape. and to live close to the ground and live close to the land. And this is a very unusual thing because you go over, many of the continental cities just don't have that relationship. People are happy to live in flats and things and not have gardens. But there's been this desire to have some immediacy, some kind of more meaningful contact with land. And that this is what interests me here, is that there is a genuine love of gardens and landscape, generally throughout the UK, but it's especially in a place like London where land's expensive, it's difficult to do things. And it's been this idea, which in my first book on London town gardens, which was so important to me, which is that it's never been easy to create and manage landscapes in London, but people persist because they have to have landscapes. Just this ambition that people came to London, they wanted to have that kind of access to these small spaces or whatever they were. And what I like is this kind of the fact that, a lot of them are undesigned, a lot of them are ad hoc, but they're interesting in that regard. And they have lots of historic precedent. They were creating public gardens or gardens for the public as early as the 10th century, 11th century. Some of these still survive in strange ruins and are incorporated in other places, but that kind of continuity of a different kind of garden making as opposed to, coming from the top down, this is from the bottom up.
Well, I'd like to ask, what do you think are the defining characteristics of good landscape design?
It has to be life enhancing. I think they have to be pleasurable spaces to be in. I mean, it's very simple as that. I think that I hate landscapes that are hard work, that don't give you any joy. I like landscapes that have an element of surprise. It's very nice always to be able to give people something they don't expect, to awaken a particular instinct or just to do something like that. So
you think that this is the world capital of gardening in a way?
There's the greatest appreciation of landscape, I think, in this country. Certainly in London, yeah. And I can make a living here. You can't really
have made a living everywhere, right?
No, it's true. I mean, here's an unusual place.
Why?
I mean,
it's very fashionable to be a landscape gardener nowadays.
Is, exactly, I know.
And there are lots
of them.
In Europe, around Europe.
Yes. See, for instance, in the States, if I'd stayed in the States, much of the work, if you want to do interesting and big jobs, it's almost all commercial. Yet in Britain, a lot of the work is, still do a lot of big private work and work with individual clients. And you see, even on the continent, there are some, there are patrons, but every client that one deals with has been to England or is Anglophile or has English grandparents. Or if you go through even Italy, some of the best gardens, there are English connections. And ultimately...
Not all of them.
Not all, but a lot of them have a strong English... they like the English gardens. But I think that it's unusual that there's such a broad range of different kinds of garden landscape work that one can do in the UK, which you can't do elsewhere.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know if he was a landscaper or if he was a gardener, people like Russell Page, whatever he was. Yeah. He did gardens in America, in Italy, in France, everywhere.
Yes. But, again, it looks like a lot of places, but I mean, it's a small clientele base. It's tiny. He was doing the super rich and, an Englishman traveling abroad and doing that thing, which is quite interesting. But again, I think on the level that I'm talking about, there are, in my view, very few people who do that kind of work. It's a small world. I mean, there are lots of people who do landscape, but I think a lot of that landscape is not terribly interesting. But I think the people who do it really well, that's like everything. It's an art form, and there are a few people who do it, I think, to my standard, really, really well.
But it is your perfect right to be in love with England, right? And especially because you're a foreigner.
Yeah. Exactly.
Therefore, it's there are people who are in love with Italy. There are people who are in love with the desert. Yeah. There are people who are in love with who knows what.
Exactly.
And therefore, even if you're more royalist than the king vis-a-vis England, this is your choice.
Yeah, exactly.
You can do what you want. Obviously, not because I am a polemic, but I'm sure that the French gardeners avenge their great tradition, that the Italian gardens are Boboli from the very famous Boboli to the less famous Bomarzo. Now I don't have them in mind. The gardens in Isola Bella, but they're not English.
No, but I worked a lot on the Italian gardens. I worked for the Soprintendenza. I worked on conservation management plans for the Boboli, La Petraia, Castello. I've worked on lots of Italian villas too. So, and I love Italian gardens, but I don't live there all the time. But I think what I'm trying to say too, though, is I've worked.
I'm trying by teasing you. I'm trying
course.
to defend you.
Of course.
I know. You don't need to be defended.
No.
Say what you want.
Exactly. So I go where the work is, I suppose, and I love being asked to go. I've worked in Taiwan, for instance,
But if I understand well,
yeah.
Even if you love to talk or to work with private clients, you are more a person who is involved with public things, because Bobble is public, as Kensington, as the squares,
Oh, of course, it's a nice thing to do. And I think also it's, of course...
And then you said Russell Page was a gardener for very rich people. It means that your idea of gardening is a different idea.
Of course. I don't want to be seen as
you don't want to do nympha, you don't want to do the Hembury Garden, you don't want to do this kind of thing.
I've never been very good about doing one thing alone. I would not want to be classified as a gardener for the super rich. I find that would be unpleasant.
To do what?
Just be a gardener for the super rich. I think what's nice is to have a variety. My diet's like everything. I want lots of different things. I always say that my life is divided into three, as it were, because one is doing my work. The second one is doing research, which doesn't pay. My work pays, research. My third thing, which I really love doing, is I'm a collector. So I collect everything from Roman antiquities to modern painting and sculpture, glass, everything. So, and our house is like a museum.
Where is your house?
In Bedfordshire. We have quite a well-known collection.
Is it a country house?
Like a country house in town.
But you have a garden?
Oh, yes, yeah.
And how is your garden?
Very, very relaxed. It's like a little park, an 18th century park, which is very natural. But
you made the garden?
No, we bought it, and it's just a beautiful... It's in the middle of this town, but it's a very beautiful 18th century park, and it's got a little grotto, Georgian greenhouse, and a little 18th century temple.
And you live there?
Yep, every day. Back and forth.
Commute with the train?
Yes. But you see, that is, again, the house and the collection is it's like my world. It's everything.
So what is your collection?
Everything. It's sort of a mixture of everything. And I collect with my partner, who's the director of the Royal Palace, the Royal Collection. He's the director of the Royal Collection. He's only been there for about a year and a half. So
what was he doing before?
He used to run the Fitzwilliam Museum.
So you have three lives. Academic life.
Yeah.
Working as a landscaper.
Yeah, and as a collector.
And a collector.
Yeah, and the collecting is also a passion of mine. So.
But you always had?
Always, since I was a boy, always collected. Always. So always had shell collections. I come from a family of collectors. So then I started my own collection. And Tim and I collect together. But it ranges from everything. Because I like my life, I like being stimulated by everything. So I have no boundaries. So tomorrow I might start collecting something I've never seen before.
So you're very eclectic person.
I'm very eclectic, absolutely.
And at the same time very applicated. Otherwise you wouldn't have had all this scholarship.
Yeah, and also you see, even in collecting though, I keep registers. For 30 years I've written everything down that I bought, and I draw everything I buy.
You
everything
draw well?
I can draw pretty well. So I draw, if I buy something, I write it down, I do a description.
So in 200 years we'll visit an exhibition of your drawing.
Well, I don't know, but I'm a curator but natural curator, so I like making connections between things.
But wouldn't you like to change something?
You just change it.
I mean, there is a French architect who made the Rue de Rivoli, for instance.
Yes, I know, exactly, yeah.
And therefore he changed the face of Paris.
Yes.
You never wanted to do something, don't you have a dream? Because you don't sound neither very romantic, nor very passionate by nature. You don't have a dream to make another Hyde Park, not to only change or go back or modify what happened. But these people did it.
Yes, of course.
People did Kew Gardens, they did Hyde Park, they did Regent Park, they did this and that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you dream of doing something like that?
Of course, it's nice if you can do... I mean, I do make new landscapes too, but I...
We'll go back to Canada where it's less difficult to find space.
No, I wouldn't do that.
Or to say, listen, I would like to make a square in London completely mine.
I'd love to do something like that, but I think that these things will present themselves. I think that, you see, by nature, because of my interest and whatever, I've almost always found myself working in places of outstanding historic importance. So you have to respect these things. But at the same time, I consider many designers monomaniacs, megalomaniacs. I haven't got that. I'm not a megalomaniac. I'm not interested in... I very much from the beginning said, I don't want monuments to me. I'm interested to do things, but I don't care about my name being associated with works like that. Where I really enjoy, what I like doing is doing what I like to do, which is, as it were, when it's collecting, it's a private passion. That's my private passion. But I enjoy pleasure of working with spaces that give me, where it's a puzzle and there's so much to bring together. I don't think, for me, it's entirely pleasurable just be given a place saying, come up with a new design for something. I'm always adding things. I'm adding layers. To me, adding a layer is just as imaginative.
Do you have a favorite garden?
Yes.
Which one?
Rousham. Rousham.
Where is that?
In Oxfordshire. It's an early landscape garden, as it were. So early 18th century. And what I love this place for lots of reasons, but I also like it because almost everyone that loves this, a lot of very smart people like this garden, but for the wrong reasons, because the reason they like the garden is because they like it for what it was never intended to be, because they don't understand the history of the landscape. What I like about it is it's an incredibly strong design that was made in the early 18th century, and transformed very dramatically in the course of only 20 years. And since then, almost entirely misunderstood by people, because it's such a strong concept that it's had lots of changes to it, but the reading has still not impaired. It's still a very wonderful statement, but in fact, where there's intended to be light before, it's now shadow. Where you had open views, it's now closed. And yet, it still works. It's a remarkable place.
Do you inspire yourself by paintings?
I've always been influenced by art, because it's what I love.
But also for your landscape memory.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because my memory is everything. So whether it's sculpture, painting, the visual arts are obviously a very important part of my life. And as someone who spends my life, I spend my life in museums and galleries and churches and everywhere I go. And that's just part of me, of getting a sense of
context.
And
in your gardens, you like to put sculpture or temples or lakes or things?
No, I like some big gestures, but I don't think they have to be monumental. I kind of like people to discover things about landscape. I don't like making everything obvious. And that's why, for instance, I don't generally like formal gardens, because although I work with lots of them, it's not for me it's not an intuitive response, because it's, for me, very dull. Because what you do is you go out and you see the whole thing, and there's no interest to explore. You see almost everything straight away.
But as you have a favorite garden, you have a favorite plant?
Do I have a favorite plant? I'd say I like oak trees, a great diversity of a wonderful long living tree. I love trees.
Do you like flowers?
I love flowers, and I grow lots of flowers. But I think that ultimately I like the structural framework of landscape.
You can change the landscape much.
You can, and I think what I like doing, I suppose, I like creating a framework. I like to create a versatile framework where people can add things to. I don't feel that my composition is the perfect composition. What I think is brilliant about landscape is that there is an element of serendipity. Things are changed because of drought, or bad weather, or lack of sunshine, or thunderstrikes, or bad management, or acts of God. So many things can affect your vision. And in a way, having a slightly relaxed view of the potential of many forces completely beyond your control to change the place is, to me, really wonderful. Just for instance, I think that what I love about natural ecology is the fact that, sometimes decayed formal landscapes are really wonderful because they have a kind of romance about them that most places don't have. I am by nature actually a very great romantic, because that's all about, I love decay. That's why I also like working in these landscapes too, because it's not about making them all brand new. It's about recognizing that the layers are interesting because they evoke memories, they evoke lots of things of different periods. What I'm less interested in is just a place that's just absolutely fresh, like a freshly painted room with brand new furniture. I like patina. I want to have something beyond that because being a naturally inquisitive and curious person, I want to scratch below the surface. I want to know a bit more about things. I like continuity.
So the ideal city should be Rome.
I think Rome is a spectacular city. I love
Rome. Rome is the example of that.
It's a great city.
I agree entirely. To today.
I agree entirely. I think Rome is a spectacular place. It's one of my favourite places. In fact, I try to go every year.
It doesn't even have a good taste. It's a terrible taste.
I think it's amazing. I like the layers there. I think that's beautiful. And also, I'm the first to say that most English towns are screwed up so badly. We treat our cities here terribly. On the continent, they ruin the countryside. But the cities are wonderful. I think, for instance, you go to the Veneto, it's the most depressing place on earth now.
Where?
The Veneto. The cities are beautiful, and yet the countryside is filled with horrible things now. English treat the countryside very well, but I think the Italian towns are spectacular. And they're so dramatic and picturesque and beautiful, and I think that's wonderful. And there's that wonderful combination of landscape, absorbing landscape, bigger things, but I think Rome is a spectacular place. I try to go every year for my birthday. I was born on St. Cecilia's Day. So
when were you born?
The 22nd of November. So Santa Cecilia Day. So I try to go to Trastevere. Sometimes they don't sing very well, but it's a nice place to go for my birthday. I've always been a great Italophile because anyone who loves English landscape has to love Italy because the English were infatuated always with Italy. It's so well known that it influenced so much of what we know about English landscape comes from what people here were interpreting and bringing home from their travels abroad. So, and in that way, you see, to me, it's so interesting about the English landscape is it's more than any other tradition of landscape anywhere. It's absorbed everything. Italian gardens remain pretty true to Italian gardens. French gardens, reasonably true to French gardens. English gardens are all over the place. They're Japanese and Chinese and Russian, German and French and Italian. Everything has been tried in this big pot and all mixed round. So they're so idiosyncratic. And I think that kind of weird English habit of bringing things back and making them English is a really interesting thing because it's this idea of just constantly saying it's exotic things brought home.
But that's what you say is typical because you are a collector, right? So
it's true. I read it that way. Of course. I like that.
Collection of
I'm very much in that tradition. Of course, I like personal eclecticism.
But it's nice to have found your own place, right?
It's true. Yeah, and
you were lucky to, after all this wandering as a child and as a young man, ultimately find the place that you admire and you keep on.
Yes,
growing.
It's true.
You just add another layer.
It's true. Exactly That's
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Alain Elkann interviews.